Beit Hadassah, built in 1893 as a medical clinic for Jews and Arabs in Hebron. It served the community until 1929. After the riots, 67 Jews were killed and 70 were injured. The building was abandoned. When Jews came back in 1931, again it was used for a short period of time until 1936. Then the Jews were expelled from Hebron and didn't return until 1967. In 1967, Jews returned to Hebron. In 1968, Jews moved into the Park Hotel in Hebron for Passover, and a short time later, they moved into the Hebron military compound. There they remained until the eve of Rosh Hashanah in 1971, when they moved up to Kiryat Arba, to the first new buildings in that new community here just outside of the city of Hebron. However, the goal always was to return to Hebron, to the city of Hebron, and that was delayed until 1979. At that time, again, over the Passover holidays, a group of families sat down together and they decided that very soon they were going to again try to come live in the heart of the city of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. And so it was on the eve of the first day of the new month of Iyar, a group of 10 women and 40 children got into a truck at 2:30 in the morning in Kiryat Arba and very, very slowly made their way down to Hebron, their goal being that building, Beit Hadassah. Beit Hadassah had been empty since it had been abandoned and since Jews had come back in 1967. But the group of women and children were determined that this was going to be their new home. Driving down a back road behind Beit Hadassah, the women and children climbed up into the building via a ladder into the bottom floor, the basement floor of the building. There, what they found were rubble, dirt, garbage, anything but a home. However, being willing to live under very difficult conditions, they spread out some mattresses and blankets and went to sleep. And the next morning, when the children woke up, they started to sing, V'shavu banim l'gvulam, our children have arrived home. An Israeli army officer, hearing the singing, came in to investigate and found the women and children and said, "How did you get here?" And one of the children said, "Didn't you ever hear of Yaakov, Jacob? His ladder. He used that to get us into Beit Hadassah, here in Hebron." The women and children lived under very, very difficult conditions. They lived under siege. Anybody who left was not allowed back in, and nobody else was allowed to enter the building. However, they had much fortitude, and they were able, throughout all of the difficult times, to live happily, because here they were resettling Hebron. They could only say hello to their husbands at the front gate. But the women and children continued to live here despite the difficulties, praying every day, taking care of their daily needs under whatever conditions they might have had. Many times food and other articles had to be pulled up through a window on the street below. And on Friday nights, men from the yeshiva, from Kiryat Arba, and others would come down to sing and dance outside Beit Hadassah, with women and children watching from the gate. Well, they stood outside, dancing and singing, encouraging their spirits, encouraging them not to give up, but to stay here in Hebron, in Beit Hadassah. Every Friday night, men from the yeshiva in Kiryat Arba would come down to sing and dance like this outside the gates of Beit Hadassah following their evening prayers at Marat HaMachpelah. Then one of the men would say Kiddush for the women and the children, and they would make their way back up to Kiryat Arba for their Shabbat meal. Exactly 30 years ago, this Friday night, the men had just arrived from Marat HaMachpelah. They started to get into the circle to begin dancing and singing when they were attacked by terrorists on the roof of a building behind them. The terrorists, 4 of them, started shooting and throwing hand grenades. And as a result of that, 6 men were killed and another 20 were wounded. Among those killed was Hanan Krauthammer, Yaakov Zimmerman, Shmuel Marmelstein, Eli Hazaev, Gershon Klein, and Zvi Glatt. The day after these 6 men were killed, on Lag BaOmer, the Israeli government met in special session and then decided to implement the renewal of the Jewish community in Hebron. Only then were their husbands allowed to come down and rejoin their families. And eventually the Israeli government rebuilt all of Beit Hadassah, adding on 2 floors upstairs. These 6 men, with their lives, brought back Jews to Hebron. That took place exactly 30 years ago, this Friday night, here in Hebron. It had been only 50 years earlier, and the Jews had been expelled from Hebron, following the terrible massacre. Jews who had been expelled, Jews who had been tortured, butchered, and raped. At that time, there was no response that was appropriate. Nobody to implement an appropriate response to the terrible, terrible tragedy that took place here. And 30 and 50 years later, it was that again Jews whose blood was spilt in Hebron did not bring about the expulsion of Jews from Hebron, but it brought the Jews back to Hebron. That return to Hebron, such a fulfilling memorial to all of those Jews who had been killed here, who had lived here, who had prayed here, who had studied here, who had maintained a continuous Jewish presence in Hebron for hundreds and thousands of years, only to be stamped out, destroyed by Arab murderers. Now the Jews had returned to Hebron. That was the true Zionist response. The response to killing was to build, was to renew, to rebuild, to bring back life to where the Arabs had brought death. And so it was that out of the ashes sprung new life. Men, women, and children returning to Hebron, returning to Beit Hadassah, returning to the city of Abraham, bringing with them life, bringing with them a continuation of a Jewish presence in Hebron that has existed from time immemorial. And so here today, at Beit Hadassah in Hebron, people live. People live.